Women अभी नहीं आ रही हमें लगा ठीक है
Good morning and welcome to the Creative Theory Colloquium Day 2. Yesterday, we had some exciting panels: creative responses to climate crisis, relationality as the intrinsic core of religion, vulnerability and precarity, living on the margins, gender, space and power. And each panel raised some questions and interventions that came together with the main theme of the colloquium. The panel on creative responses to climate crisis emphasized on the need to search for indigenous knowledge, response, meanings, the local people at the grassroots level have that can pluralize our own understanding on climate, thereby transcending the binaries among knowledge systems. The panel on relationality as the intrinsic core of religion introduced concepts of performance, art, aesthetics, and affect into the discussion, and deeper philosophical questions of how we can promote interrelationality, a calm and balance, and deep love amongst each other and within ourselves. In the third panel on vulnerability and precarity, it opened up debate on neoliberal discourse with regards to its impact on marginalized sections. The concluding panel on gender, power, and space brought the discussion on gender, space, body, and agency while focusing on three marginalized identities: transmasculine identities, Dalit women, and sex workers, that elevated the discussion of the colloquium in general. It is now time to begin the day 2 of the colloquium. The panels for this day are Ontological and Relational Security in the Global South, Reasoning, Regions, Borders and Relations, Knowledge Traditions in the Law, Pluralism, Power and Relationality in Contemporary Times, Reclaiming the City, Urbanization and Contestation over Urban Space, and a special panel on Social Sciences, Pluralism and Social Transformation, which will be followed by CTC 2023 Roundtable Discussion. Now, I hand over the session to Tanmoy, the Associate Coordinator for the first panel.
Hello, I hope I'm audible. So, good morning to one and all present here. I welcome you all to the panel on Ontological and Relational in the Global South, Reasoning, Regions, Borders and Relations. The panel looks for an alternative and novel approach to the study of IR, as the IR discourse in general and Global South in particular has been majorly subsumed by the instrumental nationality of the state. A relational and ontological approach to IR acknowledges this problem as it focuses on the relational aspects of human and paves the way for the possibility of recalibration, negotiation, and reassessment of many of the issues and concerns of Global South. This panel explores some of the concerns of Global South in Asia and Africa, and the papers presented cover themes like the interplay of communalism and capitalism in post-colonial South Asia, the nature of boundary dispute between India and China, the COVID response of China, India's global international relations, and the disputed borders of Mali. And each paper tries to go beyond the limitations of the mainstream theorization of security and break new grounds. The panel is being chaired by Professor Navnita Behera, who is a professor of international relations at the Department of Political Science, University of Delhi. Her research mainly focuses on the genealogies of IR discipline and pluralizing the sites and sources of its domain knowledge, including its pedagogical practices and gender and inter-conflicts. Professor Behera has authored and co-authored nearly a dozen of books, and her most recent research has been published in a special issue of Review of International Studies, which she co-edited, and a range of international journals, including International Affairs, International Studies Perspective. She will be joining us in a bit. Our first speaker is Dr. Shailza Singh, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, Bharati College, University of Delhi. She has been actively engaged in research on the concept of security, critical security studies, everyday aspects of security and insecurities in Indian cities. She has contributed in internationally acclaimed journals like International Studies and Studies in Indian Politics, and is the associate editor of the journal The Research Board, and runs her blog Thought Watch for Creative Expression. Our second speaker is Dr. Dhananjay, who is a visiting fellow at the Center of the Study of Developing Societies and a faculty at the Central University of Gujarat, Gandhinagar. He works on cultural theory, political theory and education. His select books include Debating Swaraj. Hello? Yeah. His select books include Debating Swaraj, Purna Swaraj, etc. His research articles and reviews have been published in Economic and Political Weekly, Seminars, Social Change, Social Scientist, etc. Our third speaker who is also the coordinator of this panel, is Dr. Rityusha Tiwary, who teaches in the Department of Political Science, Shaheed Bhagat Singh College, University of Delhi, and is an Institute of Eminence Fellow at the Delhi School of Transnational Affairs. Her research has unpacked the interplay of leadership, power and hegemony in East Asia and China's role in shaping regionalism in the twin domain of political economy and foreign policy. She employs critical theory, comparativist lenses to study security, borders, gender and foreign policy in China and India. She has been the assistant editor of China Report, a journal of East Asian Studies, the flagship journal of the Institute of Chinese Studies, Delhi since 2016, and associate editor since June 2023. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Deepak Kumar Bhaskar, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, Nagaland University. Being trained in international politics and foreign policy, his area of research is India, China and Africa, where he has examined the political instability, conflict, military, democracy, external intervention, foreign policy of Africa and major powers. He has numerous research chapters and book publications on the aforementioned subjects to his credit. Now I hand over the session to the coordinator to carry forward the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanmoy. The chair will be joining us shortly in the next 5 to 10 minutes. Meanwhile, we'll begin with the first presentation. So I invite Dr. Shailza to present her paper.
Thank you, Rityusha. Thank you, Tanmoy. And I'm really thankful to the entire esteemed panel of Creative Theory for giving me this opportunity to discuss my ideas. I would say currently the paper that I will be discussing not very, but this, and it tries to look at something called ontological security discourse in international relations and situate countries of the global south. I think I can wait for a while. Navnita is already here. Should we do that? Yes. So, thank you. So, this paper attempts to situate India-US relations within the ontological security theoretical framework. It attempts to do so by looking at, one, the post-colonial identity and status-seeking framework to understand how anxieties and insecurities emerge and are conditioned in a social context. How status has been thought in relation to the broader context in which hierarchies are produced. So that aspect of relationality is something that this paper attempts to explore. Secondly, how ontological insecurities in the country of the global south, which is largely a meta category, and I'll be looking at the Indian case, are relational and are co-constituted in ontological security seeking process of the countries belonging to the global north. Tentatively, the main argument of the paper is that the ontological insecurities and anxieties of countries in the global south, here the case study being that of India, are relationally co-constituted in a hierarchical process of ontological security seeking of powerful countries, here the case being that of the US. Now I'll give a brief introduction of how ontological security is understood in the recent scholarship on international relations. Major works coming from Huseman, Midzen, Kinwall, Cricklejoy. The term ontological security is defined as security of being, or security of the self, the subjective sense of who one is. Ontological security is said to be accomplished when actors feel confident in their identity and have stable cognitive and emotional frames, having steady and predictable identities. In international relations, it is said to work to a certain degree in opposition to the concern for physical security. The central idea of OST, the ontological security is that actors are motivated to act by concerns other than their bare physical need for survival, and that these concerns can sometimes override the pursuit of physical security. However, it is also criticized for giving primacy to the traditional logic of survival and security and actorhood of the state. Now, as regards to, and here where relationality comes into existence, the source of sense of ontological securities, there are two schools of thought. One is that the source of emergence of identity and a stable sense of the self, and so hence therefore the ontological sense of security, is a self-reflexive process which focuses on actors, which means states and international relations, and other collectives slowly and gradually, reflexive monitoring of their own actions. That is the school, this is given by Steele in 2005. The second source of ontological security, the school which looks at the source of ontological security, is relational, emerging intersubjectively, focused on routinized interactions between actors and the kind of recognition they imply. The work is represented primarily by Jennifer Mitzen. Now, in this paper, what I do is I'm navigating broad phases of India-US relationship to the OST framework. And these broad phases are divided into phase 1, posturing identity through non-alignment during the Cold War. Phase 2, the phase of rapprochement, which begins from early 1990s to extending till 2000. Phase 3, the Indo-Pacific turn, and which I say the state is seeking through a tightrope walk, balancing between strategic alliance and strategic autonomy. So, the phase 1, which is posturing identity through non-alignment during Cold War, I would like to read some lines from the 1955 Bandung speech of Prime Minister Nehru. And these are some discrete lines which I've picked, which are relevant for the observations that I would like to make. I quote, even the two great power blocks together cannot conquer India, not even the atom or the hydrogen bomb. I know what my people are, but I know also that if we rely on others, whatever great powers they might be, if we look to them for sustenance, then we are weak indeed. Then next, if I join any of these big power groups, I lose my identity. The mistakes of my country, and perhaps the mistakes of other countries, here do not make a difference, but the mistakes the great powers do make a difference to the world and may well bring about a terrible catastrophe. It is an intolerable thought to me that the great countries of Asia and Africa should come out of bondage into freedom only to degrade themselves or humiliate themselves in this way. Then further, every pact has brought insecurity and not security to the countries which have entered into them. It may have produced some idea of security, but it is a false security. It is a bad thing for any country thus to be lulled into security. So these are some of the lines from the Bandung speech, and what my preliminary observations into the OST framework is that this posture, claiming an identity based on a moral force, at the same time challenging the dynamics of international politics shaped by great powers, seems to resonate the central idea of the ontological security theoretical framework, that actors are motivated to act by concerns other than bare physical need for survival, and that these concerns can sometimes override the pursuit of physical security. Insecurity or death, which is to say, of a state, here does not only mean the death of the physical territorial existence, rather death of a subjective sense of what the state stands for. However, it can be seen that what constitutes a security of the self is defined not independently, rather relationally to the dynamics of the system shaped by the powerful actors, where strategic autonomy is conditionally defined within that system of the Cold War bipolar politics. Now going on to the phase 2, the 1990s saw the estranged democracies. Now this was the term used by Dennis Cuss, the US ambassador to India, to describe what the relationship between US and India has been until the Cold War, during and much of the Cold War. It saw the estranged democracies incrementally redefine the contours of their relationship, not a smooth journey by any measure. India's efforts included the economic reforms and the nuclear tests, and embarking on the journey of status seeking as a regional and international actor. US also saw India fit more favorably into the policy of further defense posture in some parts of the Indo-Pacific, as expressed, as mentioned by Tellis, and balancing the rise of China as a part of America First policy, which became very evident and manifest during the Trump regime lately. The relationship continued to grapple with deeper structural issues related to geography, asymmetry of power, and the intensification of the US-China rivalry. The rapprochement phase in India-US relations signifies the identity formation in case of the US. However, the form is relational to and conditioned by a paradigm of India as a balancer to the rise of China. In case of the South, or fundamentally the post-colonial countries, is intrinsically linked to hierarchies and asymmetries, further leading to existential anxieties to achieve the desired wholeness. Moving on to the third phase, which is the Indo-Pacific turn, and I have seek to outline as status seeking through a tightrope walk balancing a strategic alliance and strategic autonomy. Beginning from the early 2000s, all successive US governments from Clinton to Biden have got stronger relations with India. And in the words of Frederick Gare from the Carnegie Institute, gradually encouraging New Delhi to assume a larger role in ensuring the security of the Indo-Pacific region. Directly and indirectly, they have helped India standing in Asia, and despite India's reluctance, as a balancer to China in the region. Economic, political, and strategic relations between the two countries have spectacularly intensified, yet the relationship is not without ambivalence. Congressional Research Service report outlined the areas of friction, sometimes of serious discord, as such. One, relatively closed economy of India. This is the report that the US Congress comes up with annually with respect to all the countries. So, in case of India, what it mentions, the frictions, despite the strategic partnership, strategic alliance, and close partnership claims, it says that the concerns for Congress is a relatively closed economy of India, India's cooperative engagements with Russia, differences over immigration law, India's intellectual property protection regime, localization bills, and civilian nuclear commerce. Recently, there is another phrase, because American foreign policy is very fond of coining these phrases which sort of say, reflect the US worldview and the US take on the global state of affairs, which is called French shoring. And I'm trying to sort of contrast French shoring and strategic autonomy. Now, what is French shoring? I'll come to that. Where the joint statement from the US and India in the Biden and Modi statement of 2023 mentions US and India amongst the closest partners in the world. The asymmetry of this partnership is outlined in remarks by the Secretary of Treasury, Janet Yellen, at Microsoft recently in July 23, after the Biden Modi statement, when she explained the US policy of friendshoring. She said that, in fact, I think that our continued partnership is an example of how advanced and developing countries can bridge policy differences and move forward on major policy objectives. The approach of friendshoring is to diversify away from countries that present geopolitical and security risks to our supply chain, and it is by no way a exclusive club or an exclusive membership to exclusive club of countries. So this highlights a lot of conditioning from a position of power inducting into social arrangements that are hierarchical but lead to aspirations of status seeking or the lesser powerful partners. That how, that relationality, even when it is forging partnership, and it is also catering to the status-seeking aspirations of the countries, the developing countries, the economic incorporates or inducts in a hierarchical fashion a lot of other countries of the global south. So, this is primarily the preliminary kind of work that I'm looking at. But I must say that a focus on the selfhood of the state, as expressed by the elites, and absence of foregrounding alternate subjectivities in the expression of selfhood and identity, deprives ontological securities theory per se of any transformative potential in its present form, because it's basically looking at states and their expressions and identities, other than highlighting what it does. The role in the present form is highlighting a hierarchical within parentheses, production of identities. So thank you, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shailza. My apologies to one and all. Traffic can be a nightmare in Delhi these days, and no amount of estimations prove to be right. But I shall not take any further time. The next speaker is Dr. Dhananjay. Floor is yours. Wait.
Many thanks for organizing this panel and making me a part of it. And thanks to organizer and coordinator and chair for this opportunity to speak something about ontological security, which my entry point to understand ontological security is not international relation, but kind of some of the writings of Anthony Giddens and Judith Butler. Then moving to Jennifer Mitchell, who is part of international relations theory group. So there are Anthony Giddens, Butler, and Jennifer Mitchell are very few important interlocutors of ontological security. And in Mitchell, there is an urge to move from only to physical security to ontological security, and this ontological security is security of the self. That is the definition in Mitchell article. And the suggestion is that routinizing relationship with the significant others. This is a very important point, that we have to routinize relationship with the significant others, and actors therefore become attached to those relationships. So ontological security is based on a kind of relationship. I take liberty to use the concept for understanding the trends in South Asia, and my paper is ontological security in post-colonial South Asia, which goes against the routinizing relationship with the significant others, what has happened in South Asia. There was an interesting lecture by Ashish Nandi, which was published in one of the journals by Rockles in 2007. And according to Ashish Nandi, Southeast Asia is the only region in the world where most states define themselves not by what they are, but by what they are not. And this was his lecture in Islamabad and was published later on. There is a reason for this, but Professor Nandi gives his own reason. I think that I think there's a reason for this. I mean, why you're not defining by why you're not like others. And I think the construction of impermeable identity is important in South Asia in place of ephemeral identity. So impermeable identity has become very, very important development. I will elaborate this point later on. But historically, if we look at South Asia is a crucial reminder of anti-colonialism. And anti-colonial politics has ushered in a slew of transformative ideas and practice. Anti-colonial politics was not homogeneous. The significant trend was towards envisioning transformative politics based on activist government or activist state. So activist government was very important, or activist state in post-colonial political thought of South Asia. Though the South Asian activist government and much to ontological security, if we use this concept and go back to pre-independent state. However, post-colonial South Asia also inherited two legacies that were more than just caused by decolonization, and these were capitalism and communalism. South Asia established an alternative Asia, particularly on the ontological security, where human security, stability, meaningful life are essential component of existence. What do I mean by impermeable identity formation? And I think the impermeable identity formation is shaped by colonialism and communalism. It has certain features. So identity is a long-term identity, not ephemeral identity or short-term identity. And ontological being is perceived, fit, a comply, the way you are, you can't change, you are static. So ontological being in an impermeable identity is fit, a comply. And there is a construction of individuated ego, I mean ego in that sense, in place of collective ego in South Asian context. And what is individuated ego? Because here we develop the acquired distinction on the principle of us and them. And this is a very deliberate us and them in individuated ego, which is the core of impermeable identity. And the fundamental philosophy of impermeable identity is creation of othering. Vouches for the separation of human being while demonstrating superior values. Even the values are hierarchized in impermeable identity. This is the kind of formulation I have about impermeable identity in South Asia. In South Asia, impermeable identity also profoundly shaped by, I mean, of course, I had said imperialism, colonialism, and communalism. Four things are very crucial to understand South Asia. Or basically, some of the points which I had said, I repeat it again, that impermeable identity is through individuated ego, where othering is profound. And here there is a replacement of coalescence history. Coalescence history means collective history. So you don't have a place for intertwined history in South Asia due to colonialism and capitalism and colonialism. And coalescence history or history of collective or intertwined history is replaced by contemporaneity. So we have a prioritizing of contemporaneity. Particularities have become universalities, and universalities have been reduced into particularities. Omniscient values are defined, redefined, and accepted partially. Fourth, and there is a massive distortion of temporality of common history. So we have contemporary defining history with a loss of distortions and there is a tweaking of temporality of the history in that sense. And fifth is finally formation of a communal identity. I'm not saying that there was not, but this if we don't bring together capital and communal, or colonial and communal, then we can't understand the formation of communal identity in South Asia. There is a division based on religion, and what is important that the religion has been used for the division, and the contradiction within religion has not been discussed. So there are two developments. One is the profound sense of religion and jettisoning the inter-contradiction within religion. This impermeable identity gets sanction or validation in the global or imperialist discourse through four significance of four meaning. Firstly, the global South, global discourse or realist discourse or important discourse or mainstream discourse perceives South Asia as from the lens of existence. This is the first thing. Existence has become a fait accompli in global discourse for the South Asia. The capitalist discourse perceives South Asia as an existential realm. I mean, all are fighting for each other in the context of existence. Second, there is a strategic preponderance remains circulating values. I mean, that this reason South Asia is important just for the strategic value. And the two terms have been used in last 50 years often. One is terrorism and one is balance of power in South Asia. So terrorism and balance of power is a very important, repeated epithet in global capital for. And for example, if we use, there's an interesting study by Stephen Cohen, and according to Cohen, when democracy threatened to remove a leadership that was less than pro-American, US Embassy conveyed this priority to Pakistanis, and for decades got a hearing over the years. The embassy, most ambassadors have been major participant in the Pakistani political process even when they did not seek such influence. In the context of India, I mean, there is a Walgian ways, I mean, balance of power per se. I mean, there's an interesting remark by Azaz Ahmad long back that the significance of India is located vis-a-vis China for the global capital. And he says that aside from a possible short-term irritation, the long-term prospect is for a closer anti-China axis between United States and India, Azaz Ahmad. The third is military industry complex is very important, and if you read the lots of documents which defines the significance of India-Pakistan for the expansion of arms market. First time MIC was defined by President Eisenhower in 1961, and if you look at the various reports of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Asian countries including India and Pakistan are the largest importer of the conventional weapon. And fourthly, imperialism paves the way for expansion of capitalism in South Asia. Global capital cannot bypass South Asia, which accounts for 25.2% of the global population, which is almost 2 billion population. And this is the important attraction. And Goran Tharwan used a concept called Occidental despotism to understand South Asia. That is, remarkable lack of interest in the routine of rules and the responsible exercise of power. When it comes to the global power, this reason I'm borrowing the phrase from Tharwan, Occidental despotism, when you bypass normal rules and regulations. So the significance of South Asia on 4 accounts has germinated 2 impacts. Firstly, that the ruling classes in South Asia has been reduced in tune with the existing strategic military industry complex and imperialism. Secondly, common history, coalescence history is marginalized. Marginalization or death of coalescence history or collective history paves the way to envision 3 zones, that is, autonomous zones, contested zone, and mutual zones. In the context of South Asia, autonomous structure is being created under the guardianship of ruling classes, which reject the role or existence of each other. The independent zone is based on, or this autonomous zone is based on the exclusion of social justice and theatrics of othering. So each one is claiming autonomous zone in this South Asia, where you don't have discourse on social justice, but you have a theatrics of othering. Every moment you demand democracy, there will be theatrics of othering. Second is contested zone, which is important. And there are three contested zones within South Asia, which can be possibly identified, which is one is territorial zone. And this territorial zone is very, very important, and problems of each regions are being highlighted. They are circulated, disseminated across the board. The people's discontent, development, religion, ethnic sovereignty, alienation, violences are attached to the territory problem. The problem is not they are not untrue, but who owns up the issue. Naturally, each nation will disown the factors which lead to the such development. The practice of shifting ownership becomes essential in this territorial zone. This is rigorously done through lobbying, forming a board caucus, committed groups. Mainstream media is natural savior of this necessary habits. Nations produce disenchantment, circulate as devastation, and offer solution as enchantment in militarized society. So we have a travesty of enchantment for detachment. Detachment, as said and propagated, is the outcome of othering, and enchantment is considered as an attack. The second is the contested zone. The contested zone is also important in South Asia, which is the partisan psyche. The partition of territory is construed as the partisan psyche. In other words, there is a journey from partition of territory to the partition of psyche. Partition of the environment was a historical partition of these countries was a historical junction. Partisan psyche is an everyday lived and revered practices. Here, collective history is badly hurt. The propagation harks back on the formula of the division of people, the commonality of the notion that we have been shaped, imbibed, metamorphosed by each other are squeezed out. The territorial division might be a temporary distinction, but the partisan psyche is an attempt towards permanent rupture. Permanent rupture is rejoiced and acted by institutions. Third is global capital, which is in contested zone. And there is a race in South Asian nations to come closer to the relationship with the global capital. The next point which I am trying that these three contested zones give birth to the idea of contested engagement. It is propounded as a mutual zone. Overtly contested zones are avoided but streamlined as a tension reducing mechanism. The idea is not distorting collective history but evolving the contemporaneity perspective. Everyone is winner in this contemporary history, and actual history is a loser in the writings of history. There is a serious, I will end with my presentation with some of the critical comments on, there is a serious scholarship in South Asia from post-colonialism, decolonization, Orientalism and post-structuralism. But when it comes to understand the institutions and communalism and backed by the colonialism and institutional leadership, we don't have much comment in decolonization cases or Orientalism or post-structuralism or post-colonialism. The empire remains important, but the contradiction within this South Asia as a zone has been missed out. And I think we need to reclaim the collective history against this excessive focus on the contemporaneity, which is actually serving the middle classes and the global capital. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Dr. Navnita. The next speaker is Deepak. Rityusha.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Since there are 4 of us in the same panel, it's a rather heavy panel, so I'll try to put across my central arguments as briefly as possible. I'm looking at India-China border dispute, and I am trying to locate certain ontological security concerns therein. One immediate trigger to start understanding the border in a different framework perhaps was the events of 2020 specifically, because we have had a history of border conflict and border clashes and skirmishes. Name what you will. There is a range of conflict, the way it has been defined in India and China in terms of war, conflict, skirmishes, which is available in the last so many decades.
of COVID-19 amidst the pandemic, which was the rationale, or rather the irrationale of those times, instigated this trigger of inquiry. The fact that India-China border could flare up to unprecedented levels during the pandemic. The traditional security approaches, which center around the material, national and state-centric rationales of territory, strategic interests, security, conflict, do not sufficiently explain the fact why this dispute would continue at times when both traditional and non-traditional ideas on security were challenged due to the pandemic. The fact that dispute manifested itself into a very basic violent sense amidst this worldwide pandemic in terms of a splintered standoff along the line of actual control represented, in my view, a very deep anxiety and concern that the two states have perhaps, and it needed a kind of closer examination. So my paper basically now over the last 3 years has tried to make sense of a couple of questions. One, what does the border represent actually for India and China? How do we understand the response of these two states now that we have seen a particular kind of behavior which continued even during the pandemic? What are some of the key concerns of the ontological security in this case? My paper explores India and China's anxiety and the selfhood that is created at the border to elaborate upon the ontological security framework. And finally, I try to also place certain concerns in terms of how we define borders by refocusing and reprioritizing certain key elements of ontological security. So as I said earlier, the COVID-19 crisis posed fundamental challenges to global security, well beyond the economic and physical need and security of the states. Indeed, it posed a fundamental challenge to human security, or the survival of the human as the primary subject and agent in the way we understand international relations, the way we understand societies. It also provided strength to more critical approaches to Greek security studies that conceptualize security as survival plus, or something which is more than just the survival, some freedom from life-determining threats and therefore space to make certain choices. However, the India-China conflict in the summer of 2020 is a specimen of a threat that border security or insecurity poses opposite to the lived experiences of being, which is what is often understood as ontological security, which my other co-panelists have actually explained in much detail. Ontological security concerns a person's fundamental sense of safety in the world and includes a basic trust of the other people. And obtaining this trust is necessary for a person to maintain, I quote Giddens, a sense of psychological well-being and avoid existential anxiety. Giddens emphasizes the importance of a continuous narrative or a sense of self, which can be found in the self's ability to keep the narrative going. And this can happen when, in an ontological secure being state, we can bracket out questions about ourselves, about others, and the object world, which has to be taken for granted to keep on everyday activity going. So unless there is a sense of continuum in our understanding of ourselves, there is no possibility of ontological security. The taken for granted, what is this taken for granted? The fact that it will continue the next day and the next day and the next day, and therefore it is not confined to here and now. It is not confined in a bracket of temporality. This taken for granted provides us with answers to existential questions that we may now then start raising. These existential questions then well extend from beyond our immediate self to the idea of maybe the community we belong to, or the location that we belong to, the regional location, the geographical location, and therefore may extend to the idea of where we are located in terms of border. So this taken for granted provides us with the answer to existential questions where conditions
are placed under threat by certain critical situations. And there may be a radical disjuncture of a very unpredictable kind, which affects a substantial number of individuals, situations, threatening to destroy the certitude of institutionalized routines, something that perhaps also came out in the previous paper. So the institutionalized routine of taken for granted continuum of life is something what we see as, where borders, skirmishes or conflicts come in. The institutionalized routine is threatened. Now, the risk that we run into is that we become quite susceptible, therefore, since we do not have this taken for granted certitude, we become susceptible to the lived experiences, giving the border the status of an absolutely dehumanized entity. The dehumanization of border has occurred to various factors historically, but the primary factor that I plan to explore here is the ideational premise of border being rooted in territoriality. Further, the contiguous nature of territoriality becomes a defining feature. Contiguous which is continuum. So when we have this sense of a continuum, that unless it continues, there is no certitude and therefore there is no routine and therefore let me become anxious about my survival. This kind of a causality, if it is ruptured, that means the contiguous nature of territoriality is threatened or ruptured, then the sense of being and self that is created at the border is problematic or is threatened. Therefore, territorial continuum is what we understand as the idea of continuum at borders, because there is no other humanizing factor. There is only this factor that the territorial continuum is character with sporadic accounts of crossing over. The traveler's account, separated by centuries, is what we know of the borderlands that India and China today share. All throughout, various state-led initiatives at the border, the sponsored travelers' visits in the historical times, or in the modern times, the building of infrastructure, the movement of troops, any human element that got included through states initiative or partial states initiative, the movement of troop direct military action, political, economic, military negotiations, all of these human accounts, since they were not organic, they were not actually emanating from any kind of lived experience of humans as the primary agent, or even humans as the subject who would instigate this kind of experience. All of these partial manufactured human accounts across India-China border, they remain subsumed, they remain a subsumed category in the state-led narrative around the border. The aforementioned initiatives, which I quote from the modern times, have simply merely reproduced the border's contingent nature and role as superior to human life and human interest, instead of any kind of attempt at producing, reproducing or modifying the degree of borderness or the idea of border as a lived entity. And as a result, a border which gets created as a result of human activity. This has not happened. So border and borderness become intractable, impregnable, mysterious entities devoid of any human element, adopting a very strong anti-ethnocentric posture, I would say, people-centric posture. Border negotiations, therefore, retain the Westphalian border definition, and which obviously leads us to the argument that making settlements is possible only through the settlement of territory. Border negotiations, the nature of India-China border is more in the right to resolve the dispute. All of them have doubtably underlined the non-neutrality of the border from any human angle, from any point of contact with humans. So the approach towards border negotiation and settlement is therefore extremely mechanical. It is dehumanized, devoid of analysis of any people-centric issues in the border and the borderlands. Here the border has ceased to be a relational space, which is what we would understand as a space where the life factors define the notion of that space.
So there are no life factors defining that particular state, and therefore the dehumanization is absolute and non-negotiable in that sense. It acquires the characteristic of an absolute space, one that remains a priori human concerns and actions, reminiscent of the quintessential Newton-Leibniz debate regarding the nature of time and space, the way it cannot be negotiated and it cannot really, it's impregnable. So again, there is a portion in my paper where I'm not just looking at the negotiations and the way they yielded a certain kind of result, but also the whole problematic of, therefore, border map making. And the colonial legacy that ensues in terms of how we defined the territorial baggage that we share between the two of us. But for the current discussion, I'm again going to just moving from the very problematic way in which we approach towards map making. I'm just going to summarize my argument there also. That the insistence on surveying and mapping a complete border reflected a very this is again moving it towards the realm of political control, territory, and the concept where again territory becomes the most important geopolitical concern, where how we map. It's not contingent upon the experiences of the people who are living there, it's about political control, how we make that map. And advances in geography or surveys, all of those, the techniques of map making, the methods of surveying, all of them drove further only the application of Westphalian notion of contiguous territorially intact states. The territorial continuum became the defining nature of state's self, even through advances in map making. So there was no rupture there in this particular way of making the state's self at the border. Summing up, map making continues to play a central role even in the contemporary understanding and negotiations around India-China border dispute. And this logic basically makes borders the sine qua non of territory, a territorially contiguous state where all necessary prerequisites of the survival of its being are essentially non-human or dehumanized. Now I move to my last part, or the second concern, where I try and attempt at refocusing and reprioritizing the key elements of this self that has emerged at the border. How can we do it? Can we explore the border actually not just as a dehumanized entity but as a lived being? Is there a possibility? So I try to employ, much like my panelists together, the ontological, relational human security, human-centric security notion. And since borders are necessarily evoked in terms of geopolitics and definitive and become the definitive blocks of interstate relationship, the significant lens of human identity and intersections such as gender, race, class, ethnicity, all of them have since time immemorial gotten subsumed within these meta-narratives of territorially humanized, ontologically insecure states. To reorient and refocus this state of being, the social, cultural, national, regional, global, personal, all of these realms that intersect at the borders need to be brought to fore, analyzed and remodeled in terms of our new understandings of border. And to construct this relational knowledge and to make meaning of India-China border from the point of view and experience of communities, individuals that inhabit the borderlands, the established hierarchies of identities need to be overcome, and the hierarchies which take the form of reductive identities, they can be epistemologically quite dangerous when we are trying to have this relational knowledge building, because they tend to lead us to believe that we know what we do not know actually about the other, what we perceive as the other. And therefore a sustained relational dialogic understanding of borders across the borderlands over a sustained period of time amongst actually the people who are living there is the first step towards this construction of relational knowledge. A remodeled version of border as a possible site of interaction between the lives of people, the natures, the systems, the institutions becomes the necessary second step. The questions raised by geopolitical borders, even under globalizations, are real or implied and therefore must be examined by bringing to focus interrelational, people-centric space where notions of security, lives, and livelihood are re-examined from people's perspective. The distinction or the binary between real borders that refer to official point of contact between nation states and implied borders that are embodied in the lived experiences of settlers, travelers, immigrants, people who inhabit borders, including those who are part of security forces. This binary or this distinction between real and implied border needs to be bridged. And the process of understanding in this site where real nation states are present and are upholding or disputing an implied border would need to accept multiple ways of experiencing and knowing the geographical regions, away from absolute relativism in which human interaction is a mere reflection of culture and therefore allows no commensurability or communication between across cultures. And there's just one caveat which I'm going to put here and then just finish my this thing. The relational human-centric reorientation also needs to have certain implicit universalism, because unless that is there and unless there is a idea of partial equivalence of being and self in a one culture explains the other culture sense, and a common modern perspective on what is the implicit shared at least partial universal perspective, then this kind of relational co-growing space cannot actually be built at the border. So I'm going to just stop here and thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Deepak. Dr. Deepak, what is yours?
Thank you, ma'am. First of all, thank you, the organizer, who gave me the opportunity to be here. Being last in the panel, basic things has been already talked about, and I think what I'm going to speak on and what I'm working upon, which is very raw in a very preliminary stage. But in terms of ontological security, then my continent where I work upon, that is Africa, becomes very important. And in fact, this question is the most prominent and primary question in Africa. More importantly, international relation, is very focused on border security and physical security. So ontological security appeared very late. Interestingly, everything is done in the pretext of ontological security. But Africa, which is largely ignored and for long considered as a dark continent, needs to be looked from this perspective, especially ontological security perspective. And because ontological insecurity is already at the core in Africa. So I'm basically looking at this in terms of the level of analysis, if you look, the man, the state, and war, if you look, it was. So I'm looking at the first level only now. And security, pre-global era was by narratives of belonging to a very defined political communities. And political communities are reflected here in terms of state. State in Africa has, or overall, the idea is about, the provider of security. But not only provider of physical security, but also the ontological security. As everyone talked about, Anthony Giddens, Mitchell and all, I'm not going into that. So the fundamental things what I'm bringing from Anthony Giddens to analyze here is how you know, the person's fundamental sense of safety in the world and, you know, basic trust of the people can be an ontological security, and to obtain that kind of trust becomes very necessary for a mention, for you know, to maintain that psychological well-being, as Rityusha also mentioned, and avoid existential anxiety. But if I look at the events, you know, like 9/11, like war on terror, like financial crisis of 2008, COVID-19, hunger, poverty, violence against women, etc. Everything, the problems of security, of survival, but you know, there is a existential anxiety that is that I must frame it in security of being. So ontological security in Africa has been the primary question. The state of the continent in every sphere has failed to be a provider, whether a physical security provider or net, you know. So I look at the state itself is now becoming a being, rather you know, going and taking care of the being for whom the state has came into existence. On Africa, so the second largest, the continent is full of resources, all kinds, in fact unaugmented as well, but all in dead stores that Africa is suffering from resource curse or dust disease, whatever you say. So the suffering is anyway not getting reduced with time. Nevertheless, the state as a security provider, as I say, failing at every front, be it any of, you know, the 2030 agenda of sustainable development goals, even, for example, like no poverty, zero hunger, good health, and 16 goals are there, so I'm not going to detail that. Before this also, there was a Millennium Development Goal where they proposed eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education, reduce this, that. But the question, these statistics are just to bring attention to all, but the truth lies somewhere else. The question is that why this apocalyptic failure is. Interestingly, we find commonality in Millennium Development Goals and you know, Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. The commonality is that you find in the goals, that is 16.4. Now, this commonality, here lies the contradiction. Those whom Africa is trying to partner with, they are the one who created the situation throughout the world, I feel. But the world and Africa as well is accustomed, you know, and comfortable with this situation. And this comfortability comes, like Rousseau mentioned it very well, that if man live in a particular system for a long time, they start liking it. Hence, everything is good. If not the system, then you know, responsible for this, but say destiny. United Nations Department of Economics and Social Welfare is full of progress report, but what kind of progress it is when the target itself, like, you know, the target should have been equality, justice, freedom in totality from fear and want, but the demands of these solutions need, as you said in the last lecture, like, you know, whose future, whose you know, whose family. So here the demand needs the solution which not even academia is convinced with, that is you know, the Marxist solution maybe. So Africa is continent about which the world only knows that talk about any problem that exists in Africa. So here, coming back to the ontological understanding, the African self is suffering from all kind of not only possible problems, but I say impossible problems. Impossible problems, I mean the problem which cannot be imagined in 21st century. All MDGs and SDGs targeted problems exist in Africa. So Africa is struggling from a dual problem. The problem of self. Problem of self means that the ways they see themselves, and the problem of other self, the way they have been seen. Look at the projection of Africa in Hollywood movies and everywhere, how they've been projected, that they're barbarian, they come with the guns, and they start shooting people. So before this duality, Dr. Rai said, Ashish Nandi saying this, that how, what kind of, how the state wants to see themselves. But here Africa is, showing the reality. They want to show the reality. But the other self has overpowered Africa so much that probably it is impossible now, it seems impossible now that Africa can show themselves as they want to show. So before globalization, the idea of security was, like I said, political, territorially defined political community. In modern time, the state they performs various ordering functions. That's why they are considered as ontological security provider to citizens. But actually, it seems that the state seeks this security for themselves, and they take umbrella of ontological security of citizens to cover it. It is basically said that state provides not only physical but also ontological security, as we mentioned. But I feel like the state takes the legitimacy of being whole of all divided segments. It can be sufficed by bringing like Hegel's March of God, stating March of God on earth. Means the state is a big whole, comprises of all divided segments, right? So, if Anthony Gandhi says that ontological security refers to a person's fundamental sense of safety in the world and include basic trust of people, this kind of trust is required to maintain, the sense of psychological being, not only for the people, they were the one who instigated this genocide. There was a sequence of, because the ethnic identities were already existing before the colonial people came, but then genocide came. To look in the age of globalization, the state have extended the area of their highly contested legitimate violence, the coercive power. The globalization has spreaded liberal democratic institutions, probably with a renewed commitment by both intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations to humanitarian activism and intervention. But institutions are, it has been said that institutions are necessary for not letting a state to be predator. But in Africa, institutions have died their death, and the state itself fell into existential anxiety. Moreover, the events of the world show that the state has miserably failed to protect its citizens from any kind of transnational threats. For example, 9/11 and thereafter on terror, the financial crisis, as I said, and then COVID-19, where the state was no more March of God, lost the image of provider, became head counting machine, barricading the movement of the people. Then the state called for a retreat from neoliberal project and strengthening statism. Brexit is example for that. Donald Trump's win is example of this. But was this solution to the problem? They probably forgot to depart from the problem to solution. Rather, they departed from problem to more problems. Anyway, the question of ontological security in this context, I try to imagine, and I say ontological security, the security of self or being, if it is, the right of the people to live in freedom and dignity is somewhere attached with this idea or not. That's what I'm trying to explore. So the second thing what I'm talking about here. So the question what I'm taking in my paper is like, can this idea of national self, because in IR there is a hegemonic understanding of national security paradigm, national self. So the duality is that state itself considered has been, as being the self of the self, bigger self. So if the state, the question of security of state is more important, than being the question of security. Represent all and protects all. National self is predominantly reflects the in Marxist term, if we say bourgeoisies. In securing the national self, the bourgeoisies are secured, and others faces existential anxiety. So in Africa, the political class overpowers the other self in the name of fragmented self. And last year I said that self is divided in Africa, and until unless the self is united versus this national self, that cannot be protected and so on. So still, I'm looking at a few more things in this. As I said, this is involving, but my primary argument is that whether state, who has been the agency of security provider, now it seems that the state itself is being, secret security, ontological security seeker. That's the basic argument which I'm trying to place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Deepak. I'm sorry I tried to rush you towards the end, but I was given a sharp time limit of 11. There is an intersecting point that all of you are trying to look for between ontological security and the literature on relationality, and I find ontology as a term should provide you that base, but the term the literature on relationality itself is coming from several different vantage points. And it would be helpful as you go forward with your papers to just foreground as to what particular body of literature is your argument being grounded in. Like, for example, Prof. Shailza, in your paper, I felt it was veering more towards the earlier body of literature on relational terms, which is veering more towards constructivism. We are looking at intersubjective meanings, we are looking at the emphasis of relations, but it's very distinct from what, for example, Dhananjay talked about the relationality, which looks at the question of the self and other, which is problematizing the question of time and space, which is problematizing the question of the state, the particularities and the universalities. So within the relational literature, there are several strands, and it would be helpful for you to just foreground as to where are you coming from. And the second part, interesting that I found is that all four papers, all of you talk about ontological security. The interesting thing is that if you were to try and intersect relationality with ontological security, then the whole language needs to change of the state and the citizen and the othering. That whole language kind of goes out of the window, because that's the first thing they are problematizing and saying that does not work. That is not how you look at reality. So, the discourse, for example, from Dr. Deepak's argument of the state itself as it becoming, to you, my suggestion would be, if you're trying to understand the failure of the state, actually go deeper into African philosophy. Maybe if you're looking at interest of relationality, look at the concept of Ubuntu, as to where they are coming from, because their idea is I am because you are. So you can't really look at self and the other. So there's no question of looking the self and the state as separate beings, national self. And it's interesting as to how much that philosophy is beginning to impinge on the literature that is coming from within Africa. And as for the failure of the state, look at the works of, for example, Siva Prabhuvi and others who are basically saying that the structural linkages that the African state had with the metropolitan structures and how it has not been broken up. And that's why the state itself becomes a source of insecurity for its citizens. So if you're looking at the question of ontological security, then that's one way to go at. For you, Dr. Shailza, my only one suggestion is that, when you're looking at the ontological security and you're looking at India and China, the variables that you're taking, they need to be kind of located in the body literature, because if you bring in the relationality, the later part of the relational term literature, then those variables of balancing, they don't really speak to them. So it's kind of, just I think foregrounding will help as to where you are. Dhananjay, I think we need to have a longer conversation outside. But I found it fascinating how you were able to kind of, link the idea of the global capital and the communal identity and how we are losing out the collective histories. I assume you are familiar with Govinda Babra's work on connected histories. And actually that is what, the funny thing or the ironical thing I found in South Asia is that on one hand we're looking at impalpable boundaries. On the other hand, if you were to go deeper into history and looked at the lived realities of people, it's as relational as you can be. So I think that this juncture that needs to be pointed out is that the state-centric narratives are not speaking to the people's own lived realities. And how do they speak to them would be very interesting conversation to have, as to how it kind of evolves. And Dr. Rityusha, COVID and other things that I found very interesting, and I know where to direct my next PhD student to, because she's also looking at the idea of borders as to how the borders, you very eloquently pointed out as to how borders have become a dehumanized space. But actually relationality and the ontological security discourses give you a lot of windows to, kind of robustly challenge that discourse. And how start looking at borders, how start looking at state as a lived reality, as a being. So, you probably, work that she's trying to do is looking at both the communities, the missionary community that is on both sides of the border. How do, from their lived experiences, how do they understand the borderlands? So the theoretical openings that you're looking actually will give you the base to challenge the time and space question that you mentioned, the self and other question that you mentioned. So there is a very, the transformative potential where you ended is what I would say where you need to begin at. So that that space is there, but I think if you begin where you ended, that is going to open a completely new doors for changing our understanding of the Indo-China border dispute. So that's what my suggestion for you would be. Floor is open. I'm sorry, very few minutes left for questions, but you're welcome. Anybody?
I have a question, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. 2, 3. I only see 4 hands. Let's take 4. 5. Go ahead.
There are many
I'm going to ask you to note down the questions and identify who you're directing the question to, and I would ask the panelists to answer in one go just to save time. And I'm going to be beholden by the organizers. They can throw us out of the room. So go ahead. Keep it short.
Very small questions. One is to Dr. Dhananjay. It seems that you are trying to argue that delinking from the global capital could be the way forward. In a way, you are also saying that cultural logic and logic of capital somehow are enmeshed. But it seems that, I could be absolutely, all of the panelists are trying to argue that delinking from the global capital is the way forward. In some way. Or what is your position? Yeah.
It would be helpful for us to know who you are.
I'm Varun, PhD candidate at JMU.
Okay.
Should I ask?
Go ahead. Kindly keep it brief.
Very brief suggestion for chair, very important suggestions, but nevertheless the papers are really very interesting. My question is directed to Dhananjay. You have presented a framework of capitalism and communalism. In that context, I just want to ask, the significance of historical memory. You know, particularly in the context of South Asia, what has happened that we are giving importance to memory by privileging victimhood. You know, that recently in India, the horrors of partition that will be displayed, does it serve the purpose of neoliberalism, or as you said that it will weaken the collective sense of history, the shared history? You know, so this is also very important. A strategic importance given to historical memory. So this is my question.
So my question, it's a general question for all the presenters. The ontological insecurity that we have been talking about, is it a bureaucratic construct? Because we don't have a political imagination of ontological security, therefore this is bureaucratically, constructed and driven, ontological security is the external front. Why am I asking this question? Because when you look at the political imagination, for example, Nehru, it started glimpses of world history. At least he had a kind of civilizational imagination, and complemented by discovery of India. So 34 glimpses of world history, 42, 45 discovery of India. One complements the other. In other words, there was a political imagination of the internal self and the external self. Are we missing that, for which the kind of ontological security is coming about? The other question, Dhananjay mentioned about reclaiming collective history. Is it also, or do we also need to reconstruct it as reclaiming constitutionalism or the constitutional vision of, because that was not only internal, that was also external, reclaiming constitutionalism so as to secure ontological security. Thank you.
Appreciate sharp and quick questions. Yes, quick.
So this is Navnita. My question to Rityusha ma'am is how capitalism is affecting the territoriality. And the second question is, how do we challenge the notion of becoming a superpower? For Dhananjay sir, how might G20 and other summits like this help in addressing conflicts between the borderlands? But sir, how linguistics is defining the African self? Thank you.
That's a long list. I don't know how many would you be able to answer. Yes. Okay.
Thank you. This is Chadha this side. So I had a question which can go to both Dhananjay sir as well as Rityusha ma'am. So I was interested to understand how would you take the case of CA where the nation state is, where there's a people-centric understanding of nation state, but there's a very skewed understanding, a very perverted understanding of nation state. And while there is a promise of nation for Hindus as offering an ontological security to the collective Hindu people, it is also constructing a lived experience which is in between history as well as providing a secure future. So how would you respond to that?
Thank you. Nupur?
Yes. See it where there is also politics of denial. And also in terms of what are those borders, right? So we buy a map of India, China, whatever those borders, right? So we buy a map of India, China, whatever the entire, and then we don't know. So we also think that there's also invisibilizing of people. They're there, and then we are not sure in terms of where they can actually claim their nationhood. And then that is why the whole idea of dehumanizing is something which becomes far more, problematic.
Sorry to rush you. I have 3 more questions. I'm going to close there. I don't know when. Sorry, can we just one?
I think we will discuss. I just would like you to consider the Indo-Nepal border. Yeah, all 3D is exactly what you're talking about. It's a more humanized border, which is being now closed actually. Now we are facing a problem. So thank you for putting things in perspective. We are trying to have a cross-border cultural dialogues. Probably that is one of the models. Sorry,
That's okay. Soon I'll come to you next.
Hello everyone, my name is Tanmoy. I'm a MS student in CPS. So my question is to Dhananjay sir and also to Rityusha. So sir, the question of indigeneity, especially in the northeastern India, sometimes coincides and sometimes counters the idea of territory. And this territory sometimes has a colonial genealogy, which has persisted even in the post-colonial times also. So my question is, how do we see this idea of indigeneity and how do we relate it to the major protruding problems of the region, like cross-border migration or even interstate conflicts between the northeastern states regarding bordering states, and how this idea of indigeneity deals with the idea of relational security, human security. And as Rityusha ma'am has said, this idea of human security has an implicit universalism. So how do we situate these ideas of indigeneity and universalism and link them to human security? Thank you.
Large questions. Go ahead.
I'll also brief manner. First of all the paper was so wonderful. We got a perspective on our relationship because of borders can also change. All the relations are not similar. Like, when we come to Africa, scenario changes. China, obviously, and then South Asia, most interesting because we are South Asians. So given all of this, there are three selves, it seems, that are sort of colliding, intersecting, opposing. One is global colonial metropolitan self, which is also self of the state, though of course governed by the logic of capital. The second one is the self of the state. There's a whole theory of interests of the state, where all these international relations very much focus on. The third one is people self, because people have made very clear, which is very good, that there is a difference between the interest of the self of the state and the self of the people. You know that self of the people is also a very complicated concept, because there can't be one collective self, we are fighting for it. So given these kinds of complexities, right, do you think that this notion of ontological security gives us a sense of theoretical satisfaction? I'm not saying that I'm dissatisfied, but yes, you people have complicated it beyond our comfortable, our anxiety, our comfortable.
Yeah, thank you. Last question.
Oh, thank you so much. This is Jigyasa, and I would extend some of the things that the chair said earlier, as well as Professor Savita Singh's just remarks right now. This question is directed to Dr. Rityusha Tiwary. When, and you hinted at that in your presentation, when you said that there is, of course, the self of the state and then the lived experience of the people, I was hoping and that you could answer the question wherein anxiousness becomes part of the lived experience of the people, and then that becomes their space of trust, wherein what I'm trying to say is that in borders you expect that the normal or taken for granted is the political anxiousness, that you're always comfortable around the question of chaos and also not so much around stability. Now, how does that function? And that goes deeply into how then the state works in terms of institutional ritualization of that violence. So in that sense, lived experience gets to the state, but through a relational, cycle where the anxiousness is created by the state, lived by the people, then hence created by the state. Thank you, Chair, for your patience.
Okay, I would be honest. If the panelists try answering all the questions, we need another session. And the organizers came and told me to leave the room sharply at 11:15. It's already 11:22. So please, my request to you is pick any one question and rest outside the room, engage with them, because I've been told to wind up the session in 3 minutes precisely. So
maybe a half minute.
Yeah.
So I can see.
1 minute each. 1 minute each. That's it. 1 minute each. Okay. And I'm going to enforce that.
Firstly, 10 seconds answer. I'm proposing, this was answered by, in many books by Prabhat Patnaik on delinking from capital and all that. Delinking capital doesn't mean that you are going for the self-enclosed society. There are many ways one can. And I'm not reducing the cultural logic to this, but there is a reading in global capital and the communal reading, the kind of surface here they want. And I agree with this historical memories, and whether your question on ontological security is a bureaucratic one, I don't think there's interesting work by The Psychic Life of Power by Judith Butler, and you can't accuse her for bureaucratic category. You can accuse Anthony Giddens for third way, but not Judith Butler for that. And reclaiming constitutionalism and various reasons. G20, I leave to the other distinguished scholars. Sanjana's question, I think any theocratic state would be bereft of social justice. So this should be, any sophisticated theocratic state will not allow any kind of social justice, howsoever you claim to be A+ identitarian. Yes, that's very important. But along with decolonization, decommunalization is also very important, I think. And Nepal, India is fine. And that is a very apt example. The EU wants border and other things.
Outside. A bigger, longer discussion. Over the tea.
Okay, I'm just going to put all the questions together. Savita ma'am's, Tanmoy, Varun, Jigyasa, and Nupur. The link between capitalism and how we look at borders. Is there a mediation that capital plays here? Of course there is. All the idea of military-industrial complexes. Why are we having a heavily militarized border? What is the state intervention there? So I think there is a lot to draw upon in terms of how we look at the role of capital here in the way borders are dehumanized. So there's no delinking happening as of now on its own, but the relational capacity of a border to place the lived experiences in a co-shared space where we start at least talking to each other. So we don't look at borders as dehumanized, but look at borders as lived realities. And then if that lived reality is difficult, even for a troop who is posted there, perhaps in many spaces between India and China border, there is a lived reality of only the troops who are stationed there. But then that lived reality also needs to be brought in our cognizance of how humans are interacting with each other, and is there a possibility of a different kind of interaction. There is an invisibilization of experiences, there is a cyclical viciousness that we see in creation of anxiety and then recreation of that anxiety as a lived experience, so on and so forth. Jigyasa and Nupur. Yes, of course, and that is the logic of the state in recreating that anxiety again and again, because the state also has a interrelational, vicious, complex narrative with capitalism going on. Nobody would be selling us these many arms if we didn't need them at the borders. There's an entire military refocusing on this side of the border from that of Pakistan, and now we need even more arms. So I'm just going to rest there.
Thank you. Good.
So not many questions were directed specifically to the paper. Thank you, Professor Navnita, for the comments. As my co-panelist said, that delinking from the global capital, that's not an idea per se like closure, but alternative imaginations. And as Professor Datta also said that not a bureaucratic imagination. The point of my paper was to highlight the relationality which is being conditioned in a hierarchy. Co-constituted. So ma'am, Professor Behera is involved in research on relationality, pluriversal relationality. Now these kind of alternate imaginations from this part of the world. So where Dr. Rityusha stopped, that how do we, my paper stops where Dr. Rityusha starts talking about, how we need to see ontological anxieties, how to sort of levels of ontological anxieties, and they need to figure in the concept of ontological identity that we see, that we form, not just identity of the state, or not just going into the identities which are being conditioned hierarchically as contemporaneity that Professor Dhananjay talked about. So the idea is to start talking, as my co-panelists said, and problematize and also create languages which include the different kinds of identities which are precisely because of this hierarchical co-constitution. They are problematic, they are conflictual, and they are not stable identities, and there is a mismatch between identity and recognition. So I think that's the whole idea.
Thank you, ma'am. I will just say that, thank you very much, ma'am, for giving me the new way to think upon. But ma'am, yes, we are trying. It's very difficult to understand multiple things at one point, but we are trying hard to. Because why I got interested, because there's one, like Acharya Ramana was asked by his disciple that what about others? He says there is no others. So that's where I'm trying to relate that cosmological understanding to this, that how we can bring that self and others concept, that duality should be embraced. Yes, linguistic, you read any word, I don't know Swahili yet, but whatever French reading could do. All the readings in Africa is basically talking about no others, right? And that where the real direction we can get. But yes, if we read Swahili language, which is a major language, most of the countries local language, so then probably I'll get a little more. But still, that text is not. I learned French and I'm reading those. So that's what.
Thank you. And my apologies to the organizers.
Thank you so much to all the panelists. We'll be breaking for tea now. The tea will be served just below the conference room. We will meet at 11:45.